After the fall of Rome, Europe no longer had one dominant force holding everything together. Now, the church did provide a kind of glue that connected Europeans in a lot of ways, but politically and militarily, things were kind of a mess. And then you had waves of pressure from all over the place. Vikings came down from the north, Muslim raiders and armies pressed in around the Mediterranean, Magyars came from the east. And for a lot of Europeans, the safest thing to do was to hunker down and try to survive. That's part of how we get the feudal system. Local lords, castles, knights, land protection, and people living much of their lives close to home. Europe, in a sense, crawled into its medieval turtle shell. So what brought it back out? Well, Charlemagne tried to rebuild something like a united Christian empire. The Crusades gave Europeans a taste of what the East had to offer. The 100 Years' War brought misery and chaos. And then the Black Death came through and made the Middle Ages even more miserable. Yeah, Middle Ages were no picnic. But if we had to pick one thing that helped open Europe back up again, what would it be? What if it was a road? Not one road exactly, but a whole network of trade routes stretching across deserts, mountains, cities, and empires. A route where silk, spices, paper, stories, religions, inventions, diseases, and all kinds of ideas move between East and West. The Silk Road. And one of the most famous Europeans to travel that road was a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo. He's almost legendary with a swimming pool game and all, but Marco Polo was a real guy and really did travel all the way to China and eventually made it back. He then became one of the great storytellers of a world that many Europeans were only beginning to understand again. A world bigger, richer, stranger, and more connected than they had imagined. And that's important to think about because this is happening right around the time Europe is starting to crawl out of the Middle Ages and move toward the Renaissance. Let's dig in. Okay, so in my history class, when we get to the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, I usually blend together a few different stories because they really do connect. We talk about Marco Polo, we talk about the Silk Road, we talk about the Mongols, and then eventually we get into these powerful Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, Milan, and Florence, and from there we can start talking about the Renaissance and families like the Medici. So this is one of those stories where if you pull on one thread, suddenly you realize it's connected to about 10 other things. Basically, we're at the end of what historians usually call the Middle Ages. And I always remind my students that these time periods or categories historians created later so we can make sense of the past. It's not like somebody in the year 1300 woke up and said, well, the Middle Ages are just about over, better get ready for the Renaissance. That's not how history works. Things overlap. They blend. Some things change quickly and other things continue for a long time. But by this point, Europe had gone through a lot. You had the Crusades, which were this long series of wars between Christians and Muslims over the Holy Land. You had the 100 Years' War, a long, brutal series of battles between England and France. And near the end of it, you get Joan of Arc helping rally the French against England before she's captured and burned at the stake. Not exactly a happy ending for her. You had the Black Death, which killed millions of people and shook society in a way that's hard for us to even imagine. And after something like that, people start to rethink things. If a third or maybe even half the people around you are gone, suddenly labor is more valuable, workers can demand more, people start moving around. Some people start asking, do I really have to stay locked into this same system forever? What do I want out of this life? Let's live a little. It's almost like Europe starts crawling out of its turtle shell a little bit. But even before the Black Death, another big thing was happening that helped crack open Europe's view of the world. That's where Marco Polo comes in. Now, Marco Polo did not discover China. Let's get that out of the way right now. China knew where China was. But Marco Polo became a really famous example of something much bigger that was happening. The reopening and strengthening of trade routes between Europe and Asia. And a big reason that happened was the Mongols. Now, the Mongols were terrifying. There's no getting around that. When Genghis Khan and his descendants conquered, it could be absolutely brutal. Cities were destroyed, people were killed, entire regions were shaken up. But after the conquest, Once the Mongols controlled these huge stretches of land across Asia and into parts of Europe, they also had a reason to keep the roads safe. And when roads are safer, merchants can travel. When merchants travel, goods move. When goods move, ideas move too. So in a strange way, the Mongols were both destructive and stabilizing. It's one of those weird history things where you can say, that was terrible. And also, that changed the world in some positive ways at the same time. The Silk Road had existed long before Marco Polo, but under the Mongols it became easier for certain travelers and merchants to make these long-distance journeys. Silk, spices, paper, stories, technologies, religious ideas, all of that could move across these routes. And Marco Polo, this young guy from Venice, ends up traveling east with his father and uncle. They go all the way to the court of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and the Mongol ruler of China at the time. And this trip is unbelievable. Not unbelievable as in none of it is true or none of it happened, but unbelievable as in imagine being a young man from Venice, Italy, and traveling across deserts, mountains, strange cities, unfamiliar languages, foods you've never seen before, customs you don't understand, and eventually ending up in one of the most powerful courts in the world. That's not exactly a weekend getaway. He was in it for the long haul. Marco spends years in the East, at least according to his account. And when he comes back, he has stories that sound almost impossible to Europeans. Paper money, coal being burned for fuel, huge cities, massive wealth, strange animals, different customs. And some of it probably was exaggerated or dressed up in the storytelling style of the time, but a lot of what he described lines up well enough that historians take him seriously, even if they don't believe every single detail exactly the way he told it. One example I like from Marco Polo's book is the story of the old man of the mountain and the assassins. Now, this sounds like something straight out of a movie or a video game, but there really was a group in the Middle East that Europeans called the assassins. Their leaders became famous in Western stories as the old man of the mountains, especially because they were believed to command followers who would carry out targeted killings of political and religious enemies. You need someone taken care of? The old man of the mountains and his henchmen might be able to help you with that. This is where we get the word assassin, or at least where the traditional explanation comes from. So when you read Marco Polo, and I highly recommend you do sometime, that's the kind of thing you get. Some stories sound fantastic and some of the details may be exaggerated, but then you start digging and realize, wait a second, there really is something behind this. And that is part of what made this book so fascinating. And then after all of that, after surviving this huge journey and finally making it back home, what happens? He gets thrown in jail. Because Venice and Genoa were rival city-states, they fought from time to time, and Marco Polo got caught up in that conflict. So now he's sitting in prison, and then apparently he starts telling his story to another prisoner, Ruccello de Pisa, and I always picture it like this. Hey buddy, what are you in for? Well, funny story, I just got back from China. And the other guy's like, wait, you got back from where? So Marco starts talking, and Ruccello, who is a writer, basically realizes this is gold. You need to write this down. And Marco's response is basically, how about I talk and you write? Deal. To make a long story short, that's how we get the Travels of Marco Polo, one of the most famous travel books in history. And that book helped fire up the European imagination. Not because Marco Polo was the only person traveling. He wasn't. Not because every word he wrote was perfectly accurate. It probably wasn't. But because his story gave Europeans a window into a much larger world. And once Europe starts looking outward again, once trade starts flowing, once paper and goods and ideas and wealth start moving, you start to get the conditions that lead into the Renaissance. Not overnight, not magically, but piece by piece. And that's where the story really starts to get interesting. This is Have to Know History. History you just have to know. Thanks for being here.